Good morning. My name is Rory McAlpine. I am currently serving as chair of the board of directors of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. I'm joining you from southern Vancouver Island, the traditional territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. Welcome to everyone on what I think is a cold day across the country. Our sector in agri-food faces some big challenges with the potential for very different solutions that lead to very different outcomes for the sector. Dialogue and debate are essential for getting to better policy outcomes. So instead of shying away from thoughtful debate, the sector should embrace it. In that spirit, this policy exchange offers a platform for respectful debate and dialogue to explore diverse perspectives on critical policy issues. Without funding partners, CAPI would not be able to explore this important work. We work with partners throughout the agri-food sector and across value chains to advance policy solutions. Today's webinar is funded by Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada under the Sustainable Canadian Agriculture Partnerships AgriCompetitiveness program. It is a tumultuous time. Our biggest trading partner has seen a change in its administration, as we know. Our governing party is leaderless, and a federal election is looming. The business of farming is facing high input prices as commodity prices are softening and margins are squeezed. So today, we will ask that question: will Canadian agriculture's luck run out in 2025? So we're joined today by three very smart people that know a lot about these issues. Firstly, Tyler McCann, CAPI's managing director. Secondly, Christina Farrell, who's Chief Executive Officer for Food and Beverage Canada. And finally, Ted Billier, who is a CAPI Distinguished Fellow. Now, before we go to the panelists, we want to start with a poll. We're going to put the poll up, and it will be on your screen. And the question is, do you believe Canadian agriculture's luck will run out in 2025? So if everyone could indicate an answer to that, and over the next few moments, the answers should come straight in, and we'll kind of set the ground here for our discussion by seeing how you feel about prospects for the sector in 2025. So Amanda, when you think you've got enough results there, okay. Well, that's pretty interesting. We've got 12% saying yes, 26% saying no, some saying it's already run out, and very interesting, over half saying luck has nothing to do with it. Well, that means we've got to be thinking of some solutions to what clearly are some pretty significant risks and changing dynamics in the sector. So let's get underway. I'm going to first ask Tyler to make some comments. Tyler McCann, he is, as I said, managing director of CAPI. His career in agri-food includes policy work, working for federal ministers, farm groups, industry associations, and agri-food businesses. Tyler operates a beef and goat farm with his wife and kids in Western Quebec. So Tyler, tell us, what do you think? Will Canadian agriculture's luck run out in 2025?
Thank you, Rory. And it's interesting to understand where our participants are, because I am going to be in one of the minority groups. I really hope that I'm wrong, but I think the answer is yes, that our luck may run out in 2025. And luck may or may not be the right word. I can understand why people want to say that luck has nothing to do with it. But, my starting point is that much of the success that we've had in Canadian agriculture and food is that we benefit from some really strong fundamentals. But these are fundamentals really beyond our control, right? Demand for food, fuel, and fiber has been increasing. around the world. Canada, we're a big country with a relatively small amount of that landmass used for farmland, but we have relatively abundant farmland, especially compared to our population, so that we have the ability to produce a lot more than we need domestically, and we can export that all around the world. We've had a climate that's been pretty conducive to producing a variety of key commodities that are needed to feed Canadians and meet these global needs that are out there. And conveniently, what has been conveniently, we're located next to the largest economy in the world. So, the businesses from farmers to food processors and exporters and others have taken advantage of these fundamentals. But I think that there's always a question about whether or not we're maximizing them to our advantage to really fully benefit from these strong fundamentals that are in front of us. But ultimately, at the end of the day, things are changing. And this is why I think that, I would refer to it as our luck may run out this year. And I think it may be a question of what is the straw that breaks that proverbial camel's back. I just want to talk for a minute about the things that I think are changing. Setting aside the questions of the US, I'm sure that we'll come back to that later. But, we need to recognize that our ability to produce food is increasingly impacted by extreme weather and a change of climate. 2021, we saw a drought, we've seen floods, we've seen other extreme weather events that are becoming more and more significant. Animal diseases are becoming more prevalent, putting the sector at risk. The Beef Cattle Research Council just held a webinar on foot and mouth disease. I think in the past, we wouldn't think that something like African swine fever or FMD was a real threat, but they are. Avian influenza is already here. We've got competition from other food producing countries is increasing. They're becoming more productive and more sustainable, challenging the competitive advantage that we have. Our labor productivity is increasing, driven in part by increases in the value of what we produce. But our total factor productivity, that ability to take all of the inputs that we have and turn them into more productive products is slowing. It's still growing, but it's not growing as fast as it used to. The infrastructure that we need to move products that are produced here in Canada to other markets in Canada and around the world is under pressure. We've seen labor disruptions. We've got capacity limitations that are all coming together to increasingly impact our ability to get our products to where they need to go. The rules-based trading system around the world is crumbling. Certainly the US and what we're seeing today is at the forefront of that, but it's not just that. Protectionism around the world is an issue in the US, EU, India, China, and many other regions. And ultimately, it's not just about protectionism and trade, it's this increasing nationalism that is having governments turn away from global trade and integrated supply chains and really try and prioritize domestic supply chains that disrupt a market like Canada that has so benefited from being able to take our excess production and move it around the world. And ultimately, after years of relatively positive farm margins, the pressure on farm incomes from rising input prices, interest, land prices, and challenges with production and commodity pricing is exposing farmers to greater financial risk. And that's going to change the dynamic that we've seen on the farm gate across the country. Will put more pressure on consolidation, further changing the face of Canadian farms. We're only a couple of weeks into it, but 2025 has already been hard on the sector. We've seen the dollar going down, up and down this week. We've seen the threat of tariffs. We've seen all of these issues. And so I go back to the question, in my mind, it is what is going to be the straw that breaks the sector's back this year? Is it going to be a 25% tariff from the United States? Is it going to be an animal disease? Is it going to be another extreme weather event? But ultimately, I think the real question should be, where do we go next? And how do we understand these factors that are out there that are going to they're going to impact the sector in 2025 and better plan for it? How do we better work together so that we can really drive home that we do have strong fundamentals in the sector, that we are blessed with a land base, we are blessed with the ability to produce food, we are blessed with kind of consumers around the world that are looking for what we want to produce. But we need to figure out how do we work better together to take advantage of that. We need to use this worsening luck that we have and use it as a motivation to get our butt in gear and better plan for the future. So Rory, I hope I'm wrong, but I think that 2025 is going to be a real tough year for the sector.
Great. Well, thank you, Tyler. Let's now turn to Christina Farrell to see if she shares that somewhat pessimistic perspective. Christina is the Chief Executive Officer, Food and Beverage Canada. She leads this organization, which is a national industry association representing Canada's domestic food and beverage manufacturers. Through policy development, stakeholder collaboration, and advocacy, the organization drives the sector's agenda forward. Christina has an MA in Public and International Affairs and was recognized as a Hill Times Top 100 lobbyist in 2023 and 2024. Christina, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Rory, and thank you to CAPI for convening this obviously very timely discussion. Canada's food and beverage manufacturing industry has long benefited from favorable conditions, or luck for lack of better words, and I'm sure we could debate that, including a strong agricultural base, proximity to the US market, and an international reputation for quality. But this luck has masked a growing challenge, our declining productivity and competitiveness. Simply put, our industry is falling behind on the global stage. Canada's food and beverage manufacturers lag significantly behind some of our international peers in automation, technology adoption, and operational efficiency. It isn't just a numbers game, it directly impacts our ability to compete globally, especially as input costs rise and margins tighten. Without addressing this productivity gap, we risk losing market share both domestically and internationally. At the same time, as we've all seen, the Canada-US relationship is increasingly unpredictable, and we're seeing a lot of policies by Twitter or by X. Tariffs, protectionist policies like Buy American, and supply chain disruptions only highlight the vulnerability of our reliance on a single trading partner. To thrive in this uncertain environment, we need policies that not only strengthen this relationship, but also diversify our market opportunities. And it isn't just external factors holding us back. Internally, structural challenges such as an inadequate infrastructure, whether that's housing, childcare, transportation, labor shortages, and an inefficient regulatory framework that often hinders innovation has stifled our progress. These challenges aren't necessarily new, but the urgency to address them has never been greater. The question, will our luck run out in 2025, should actually serve as a bit of a wake-up call. We need to shift toward a forward-looking policy framework that prioritizes enhancing productivity and competitiveness across the industry, both in primary agriculture and in food and beverage manufacturing. This means, and there's lots of things that can be added to this, but investing in technology and automation. And I would like to point to a lack of federal investment in this area for food and beverage manufacturers specifically, with very little funds available to SMEs, which make up the majority of the industry makeup in Canada, and which is needed to modernize operations to close the productivity gap and remain competitive. Addressing labor shortages through training and immigration strategies that equip our agri-food sector with the talent it needs, streamlining policies to encourage innovation and reduce barriers for businesses to grow and compete effectively, and expanding our trading relationships beyond the US to reduce over-reliance on a single market. The stakes are high. Food and beverage manufacturing is actually Canada's largest manufacturing industry, which surprises many, and its success is critical to our primary agriculture as well as the broader economy, supporting jobs and communities from coast to coast to coast. And by focusing on productivity, innovation, and competitiveness, we can ensure that our industry not only survives, but thrives, and that our luck doesn't run out. Thank you. I look forward to the discussion today.
Okay, thank you, Christina. Okay, let's now move to Ted Bellier. Ted is an agri-food consultant specializing in innovation. He works with clients in both the private and public sector and currently acts as special advisor to CAPI. Ted is particularly knowledgeable about China. He has a long career before him, actually also with Maple Leaf, where I worked. Ted was an executive and involved in many international trade issues at that time. He's a very strategic thinker on trade policy. So Ted, can I turn it to you? Do you believe the agri-food sector's luck will run out in 2025?
I tend to agree with the majority on that I'm not sure luck has a lot to do with this. And let's hope it doesn't, that we can make our own luck to some degree. So I'm going to talk a little bit about history here to put this in perspective first. So this is certainly, for us, the last few days is certainly not new. We've been in this position before, and unfortunately have seen the movie a few times before, and by now should know the script pretty well. The original 1854 relatively free-flowing goods between U.S. and British North America at that point ended when the U.S. didn't need us as much following the Civil War, and began hiking tariffs, particularly a big hike being the McKinley tariff in 1890. I mentioned this as Trump mentioned it on Monday night, but it didn't seem to catch much attention, nor did his comment on manifest destiny, as he was alluding to supposedly Mars at the time, but I kind of question what he was originally thinking about in the back of his mind. The reaction to the original McKinley tariffs in Canada, of course, was McDonald's national policy, out of which grew our cities, our country, our manufacturing, our canals and railways. A bit of a humorous piece here. At the time, the Americans described the building of CPR as a rather aggressive policy when they characterized it as Canada was becoming somewhat aggressive. The U.S. actually moved the U.S. for that period of time from the Civil War until the early 1900s was pretty much in the camp of high tariffs. They began to move towards a lower tariff when they got into a recession in the early 1900s and actually offered Canada free trade. That became the subject of an election, which the Liberal government at the time agreed that this was a good idea, despite the fact that the U.S. had an abrogation clause in the offer, said that you could have free trade for now, but they had abrogated it later. And the Liberals went down to defeat in that election on that policy. The next major encounter was the Smoot-Hawley tariff in the 1930s, which, as we know, created the Great Depression, which took a world war to end. We weathered other more recent challenges from the Americans, but the discussion tends to lead to a difficult question as to whether Canada's future is better part of a closer economic union or more independent. That tends to beg the question as to whether you view the U.S. current exceptionalism as nearing the peak with Pax Americana, or whether it continues in spite of the growing multipolar world. When thinking about that, you may wish to consider work that Diane Francis published some years ago, which looked at the value of Canadian fiscal natural assets, land, water, minerals, energy, forests, etc., and found that when you add them up, the Canadian value of that was then about 17 trillion more than the U.S. value of the same. The luck is we have these assets. The bad luck is we have not come together to properly put our interests first and develop them. And before ever getting to the issue of the day, whether our luck runs out, we desperately need a strategy not unlike McDonald's national policy. If we were writing a national policy today, it would need to be done with a mindset of realpolitik rather than virtue signaling, and it would be something resembling a new form of industrial policy or neo-mercantilism, as that is the world we live in. Finally, we need to understand where the world is headed. It is going to be increasingly short of food, water, and energy, as Tyler mentioned. Particularly, it's also going to be short of electricity. Why is that important? Well, you can't manufacture without electricity. I'm working on a paper for CAPI that looks ahead to 2050 and beyond. And barring war, severe pandemic, or more people coming on board, and much more income in the world, we're going to see more food consumed. the last point I'd make is that if we look at the consumption today, we've been increasing food production about 1.4%, or sorry, 1.1% a year, but the consumption has been increasing, particularly for cereals, at about 1.4. And why are we not seeing this? Why are we not seeing this in price? Two issues, really. The stocks are largely held in China, but each year, if you look at the stocks, they've been shrinking, and more people are not eating, and more people are in fact starving. So if you add to that the headwinds that we all know very well, I'm not going to recite them all here. Most of the peer-reviewed strategies that you can look at today show only the northern countries, Canada, Scandinavia, and Russia, being able to continue to grow their productivity with these headwinds. That says that's where I see luck coming in. The luck is you got born in a place that's going to have fewer headwinds than the rest of the world. The problem is you've got to you've got to get to that place. The last thing I would say is that agriculture is very much about white space in Canada. We have to reach out and figure out where can we put our assets that are going to be most meaningful at any given time. And as people that know me know, I'm a big backer of more the LVMH, strategy in that sense than the Walmart strategy. We're not the biggest in the world. We're never going to be the cheapest. Thank God for that, actually. And we should make the most of being the best. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ted. And I just want to mention also, we've got the Q&A function working. So if anybody wants to enter a question, then please do so. Okay, we've got a range of views here, but this notion of how we make our own luck, I think kind of brings it to the question of solutions, and CAPI is always about solutions. Maybe Tyler, do you want to pick up on that? And then I'll turn to Christina because, I'm thinking about this moment, right? That whole idea that don't waste a crisis. You've got a clear external threat to our economy broadly. And in some ways, you can see some encouraging signs of the premier's rallying. We've got a few exceptions, but it feels like there is a bit of a moment here for Canada to reset on some important questions. At the same time, though, we've got the immediate challenge of trade impact and retaliation and compensation potentially to business. But Tyler, how do you look at that then? You had quite a pessimistic view of all the risks, but do you see hope at all that we can seize the moment and make our own luck, as Ted suggests?
I think that that's a big question in my mind, Rory, around whether or not kind of we have the right governance systems in place, so to speak, to be able to actually seize it. And I think if you look at kind of the last major evolution in ag policy 25 years ago, when we ended up with the ag policy framework, it was in part driven by a crisis where the federal government and the provinces needed to come together to deal with some specific issues. And this should be an opportunity where we have that kind of major evolution. I think, Christina pointed to some of this in her answers. Ted talked about how, 150 years ago, building a railway, or 100 years ago, building a railway was seen as an aggressive action. Like, I would have more hope if I heard more from governments and others about what are those types of aggressive actions that we could take domestically to better strengthen our position. And I know that there's a lot of focus on retaliations, and that gets to be a kind of a day one effort. But the fact that we aren't talking more about what are the concrete things that we can do to strengthen companies, how do we protect the businesses, the food processing businesses that are at risk? And I don't think that there's enough of an appreciation around the trade surplus that we have on manufactured food goods. Like, this should be a Canadian success story, but today, with what we're seeing, it's a giant liability. And so, Rory, I think my concern is, up until such time as we see governments willing to kind of take this on and champion this, I don't have much hope that we're going to see this be one of those turning points where we say, okay, how do we strengthen the backbone of Canadian agriculture and food? How do we better give our farmers better tools so that they can succeed? How do we better equip our food processors? How do we improve that competitiveness, enable some of those investments that Christina was talking about? And instead, what we hear is a debate around how big a retaliatory tariff list is, and so Rory, I'm maybe not that hopeful.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Tyler. Well, Christina, you are, I think, engaged with government right now on what they're looking at and questions of retaliation. What's your feeling? Is there a sense that we've got a focus, or as we said from the outset, we're kind of leaderless and the political will is perhaps lacking, but at least amongst senior officials, are they listening to ideas like you talked about, Christina? Technology gap, productivity, the kinds of things we could do in terms of a more focused industrial policy around food manufacturing as part of the challenge. Are you getting any sense that that's being considered?
I think a lot of our supports for industry, a lot of our policies geared of industry have been very reactive versus forward-looking. I thought we would have learned something from the pandemic, but I don't think we did. So I do think there is an opportunity here to step up and support our agri-food industry, both primary agriculture and food and beverage manufacturing, to come together with government and develop a forward-looking strategy, which is something that's been sorely missed. I do think they're very much all hands on deck right now with what's happening in the Canada and US and in developing that retaliatory tariff list and really a plan and a strategy. But I do think that we need to look inward a bit. As we talked about, and as other panelists have talked about too, we need targeted investments in food and beverage manufacturing and in primary agriculture. We need to prioritize workforce development, and we need regulations that create a more business-friendly environment, which will actually encourage companies to innovate and grow in Canada and be less reliant on some of our trading partners.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Ted, if you think about the challenge, some might say, well, come on, we've got a whole lot of additional trade agreements, right? We've got CPTPP, we've got a European agreement. We probably are in better stead than many countries globally. And as the U.S. retreats into a more protectionist stance, is there not trade opportunity? Of course, we've got a pretty weak dollar too, like in the sense of the immediacy. You've got interest rates have come down a lot. Inflation has come off a lot. Our dollar is low. I think we can show in history there's usually a pretty close parallel between rising Canadian agri-food exports and our currency value. But is that just too ephemeral? Like, are we counting on too much to expect that to work to our advantage relative to our competitors?
Rory, I agree with you. I think some of that obviously works to our advantage, but I really think this is a time also to stand back and say, let's talk about longer term strategy here. I mean, I am very concerned that we're all in the grips of tactics. We're all thinking about tactics because that's a short-term survival method, and nothing wrong with that. You got to survive in the short term. But this is a time when we should be actually stepping back and thinking, okay, so what's the strategy? How would we be able to lock in some of these exports of our agricultural products, but particularly can we add some value to those exports? That's the tougher part. And could we dream about maybe having the U.S. reduce our dependence on the U.S. from close to 70% or high 60s down? Maybe could we reduce that to maybe 50%, something like that, and have the rest elsewhere? That takes a lot more targeted strategic thinking. And one of the elements in that is a better understanding of when we're out carving out trade agreements, why aren't we also talking to maybe half a dozen at the most other countries that are having more or less the same problems we are? And yet there's that small group of countries control. In I think the earlier work we did for CAPI, we showed that a handful of countries basically control more than 70% of any commodity you want to think about. And I'm not counting Russia in that either. You get to that 70% without them. And so why aren't we also looking at, more of an arrangement among key exporters like ourselves and Australia and New Zealand yeah, you could pop a few more into that equation, Argentina, for example, and who basically kind of likes us, at the moment we can talk to them. So why aren't we talking to those people about saying, do we want the people, the massive number of countries that are importers to form essentially a cartel and set the rules, or should we set the rules as exporters more? And I think if we started down that track and we targeted a country or two that has huge dependence on imports, Japan is only about 33% self-sufficient in food, so they have a big stake in this game. And China at the best is 68%, and they're struggling to stay there. They're spending a lot of money to stay there. So I'm not sure we're thinking strategically about this question. We're thinking very tactically, and retaliation, of course, is just one tactic. There's tons of tactics you can put together, but you should have a strategy that's running it.
But Rory, if I can, I think, Ted, one of the issues is trade diversification is supposed to have been one of the strategies that we've employed over the last decade, and yet we are more concentrated. Our ag and food exports are more concentrated in the U.S. today than they were 10 years ago. And so we can talk about kind of the market access that we have. We can, Rory, highlight all of these trade agreements that we have at the end of the day, and yet the bottom line is kind of business goes wherever it's easiest. And it's been very easy in the US market. And so we export a greater share of our ag and food exports to the US today than we have in a long time. So we have effectively exposed ourselves more to the potential threat of that disruption. And we haven't been able to show any ability to really shift our exports to some other part of the world. And I think that's, short of telling businesses, stop exporting to the United States, ship to Asia or somewhere else instead, it really gets to be hard to see how do you meaningfully drive trade diversification. And I don't know, Christina, how many of your members are well positioned to try and pivot away from the United States to export it to China, for example?
I think because 92% of the industry for food and beverage manufacturing in Canada is those very small companies who they're not export ready. A lot of them are just figuring out how to sell in the big retailers in Canada because we don't even really have a lot of small or medium retailers for them to get ready to sell into. So it's one thing to talk about our trade agreements, other opportunities like CPTPP, CETA, and how we capitalize them more effectively. But we need to build capacity to make sure that our companies can actually meet the demand of those markets that are more complicated to deal with than our trading partner to the south.
And isn't it fair to say, generally, increasingly, trade follows investment? We've got so many U.S. invested manufacturers, and they have set up plants in Canada because, they've found an advantage, whether it's our sugar prices or whatever, and they then use that as the platform for exporting into the US market. But I guess the big question is the chill now that will occur, or the fear that some of these large plants, the ones that really do export, retreat south of the border and give up on manufacturing operations in Canada. But Ted, I know you've thought a bit about this whole question of elasticities of demand and how understanding that as we think about retaliation is very important to then potentially gaining an advantage in terms of finding ways to substitute and to increase manufacturing in Canada based on the elasticity of demand in the export market. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I think everybody can look at their own industries in the agri-food sector and calculate, how affected are they really going to be? Some products are not affected. And, you say, well, how could that be? We put a 25% tariff on. And the answer is simply because the U.S. needs them at any cost. They don't produce enough. And probably the easiest example of that is organics. I mean, the choice in that the U.S. has in organics is they can buy them from Canada, or they can buy them from China, and you know, and in the one case they get organics that are real, in the other case they may not. But you can go through a host of products and you can see to what degree is the elasticity working or not working, and so there's many, Roy. You know, I want, it may sound like a broken record, but I did go back to the other issue of the two issues. One that Christina brought up, which is we got a lot of small companies in Canada for sure, but you know, we don't really do much for them because the biggest constraint on the small companies in Canada is not that they can't export to the US, it's they can't bloody export across the country. You know, you've got interprovincial barriers like crazy, and so if you started strategically looking at what's going on here, and you know, the first thing you want to do is operate the country as a country and have free trade in Canada completely. And that would make a hell of a difference to a lot of these small companies. So it gets very costly for them to go and set up a plant in another province. Just try it if you're a little guy. And then the second issue would be that, you know, we need to rejig entirely the idea of a national strategy being something more like an industrial strategy. You know, that's something that we've grown up hating, the idea, and we just don't want to go there. Free trade's everything, but we got to realize we're in a different world today. You know, where every country is beginning to work towards national strategies that are essentially industrial strategies. And that means you start out, when you take a small company with a good idea that's moving towards some white space where they don't, you know, where the US is not going to go. The large corporations in the US are certainly not going to go into anything where they would have to have line breaks or in line speeds, et cetera. And that's an area where Canada can grow massively. And as you know, Rory, I mean, the history that the baggage I carry is that when we found that white space in China, in Japan, it was too big. The crazy part was we couldn't supply it. You know, when we invented chilled pork and went into that business, the first thing we found out was, Jesus, this is a big market. You know, it was way bigger than we could supply, and the Canadians didn't want to work together to supply it. So we've got a lot of internal problems to figure out here. But the main issue is, you know, we've got the natural advantage, and it's going to get bigger. And the last thing I'd say is in Christina's business, you start looking at AI requirements and storage requirements in the United States and wonder where that electricity is going to come from. That electricity is going to be too expensive for for food manufacturing in the United States. Canada is much better positioned all the way around if we on the energy side of the equation, from to have the electricity, and it's cooler, so you can store that electricity in the AI programs, in storage programs with the US. They're going to try to build them in the desert probably and store them there. That's crazy. So we're going to have an advantage on electricity and water for manufacturing, and if we're smart, we're going to have an advantage on smart people, which AI requires. A lot of smart people for manufacturing, not a lot of people per se, but a lot of smart people.
Tyler, maybe if I can turn to you on this question of seizing the moment and thinking about industrial strategy. We're starting to hear stories or rumblings from the Liberal government that there's going to have to be some kind of a compensation, like beyond just the retaliation, some sort of maybe a return of the wage subsidy kind of program for business. Is that the right move? Like when you think again of all the stimulus money that might be spent, I can recall going through that in 2008 recession as well, when some countries invested that kind of spending very strategically. We didn't. We did the same through the pandemic. I mean, what's your advice on that? And can you connect it to this whole question of supply management? Like, I think we all know we're clearly in the crosshairs of this new Trump administration. And gosh, if we really are going to move into a threat and a reform, the financial implications of some sort of compensation there could be very significant. What would be your advice to the government as they think about these questions?
I think that the starting point is to recognize that there's a difference between short-term support that's needed and the long-term strategic actions that have been talked about earlier. But on that short-term support that's needed, I think one of the traps that we often fall into in agriculture and food is that people try and think of the sector as one big sector. But the reality is that there are big differences between the impacts on food processors, on retailers or farmers, but even within specific value chains, the way that they will be impacted and the support that they may or may not need will be pretty different. And we haven't shown a really great capacity to be able to take more surgical approaches to say, this is a value chain we've identified that's at significant risk or where there's significant impact it's going to be, and we're going to offer them support. We tend to say, again, as was done with the wage subsidy, everyone will get it. But if you use this logic coming out of the United States that they're concerned about things like trade surpluses, we know which value chains in Canada, which food manufacturer sectors, which primary productions have a greater trade surplus. We know which ones are more likely to potentially move their business south. And I think we need to be able to understand what are the specific risks in those value chains and what are the specific things that they need and how can we offer more targeted support to have an impact at the end of the day. When we talk about emissions trading and industrial carbon taxes, we talk about emissions intense trade exposed sectors, and I think that there's got to be some equivalent to understand what are the trade exposed and most at risk sectors that require greater support at the end of the day. And again, I think the one that I'm always surprised at, Canada's got a fairly significant trade surplus in bakery goods to the United States. I think that's something that we don't often appreciate. This should be a great success story. But those plants really are great examples of the specific things Trump wants to repatriate back to the United States. And so if I was the government, I would be saying, okay, let's talk specifically to those people that are exporting in that particular value chain and say, okay, what's the risk of your plant moving? What are the supports that you needed? What are the pressures that are there? Is it relief from tariff duties? Is it wage supports? Is it extra incentives to increase investments in automation or other equipment that you've got? And you need to be able to have that more sophisticated conversation than what we've had at the end of the day. And I think that the same really applies to supply management. I think it's a little bit easier for people to understand that supply management is a different sector. It's a unique case. It's got attention. Again, probably a pretty good example of some of the things that come out of the new president's mouth don't always make sense. He was referring the other day about how they don't need Canadian milk, and I think that it was always thought it was an issue of them wanting to export more to us, not them trying to block exports. But kind of setting that aside, clearly there's going to be a desire, or clearly there is a desire on their part to renegotiate the details in USMCA. This is an example of an irritant that we have fought panels with them already in the 5 short years that the agreement's been in place, and we've kind of won some and lost some on them, but they've got at a minimum a clear sense of what they're looking for around TRQ administration, but they may want more. They may want more access to the Canadian dairy industry. But once again, we need to be able to have that more targeted approach to really understand what is the impact that it's going to be. What are they looking for? Even within dairy, more U.S. fluid milk is very different than more U.S. cheese or yogurt or proteins, and we need to be able to get past this wage subsidies for all move to really understand what's a more surgical, sophisticated approach to compensation and support.
Mm-hmm. Christina, continuing kind of the survey of the issues, you mentioned regulation. We always come around to regulation in these discussions at some point. But on that point, what are your members saying? Because, of course, you've got in Donald Trump a very strong deregulatory mantra. in a range of areas. But on the other hand, when it comes to food, well, he's appointed someone to run that file that seems very much about shutting down a lot of the available ingredients, processing technology, things that right now, in his view, generate a very unhealthy processed food industry. Are you talking about that in your membership, or what happens if there are some significant new regulatory changes that may harm our ability to sell Canadian food products formulated the way we do it into the U.S. market?
At Food and Beverage Canada, regulatory effectiveness is probably one of our top 4 issues that we're working on right now. Before, I think that we were looking a lot more internally. We were looking at things like front and package labeling, the greenwashing provisions, Bill S211 and child forced labor, some of those things that are making it difficult to compete. Now we do need to switch our attention to what's happening in the US and making sure that we can respond in a timely manner. Right now, our regulatory framework is not set up as such that we can actually align ourselves with US policies where it makes sense to make sure that we're preventing capital outflow and maintaining competitiveness. So I think as an organization, through our members, with our counterparts of the other product associations as well, we're really trying to push forward the need to modernize regulatory frameworks that actually reflect industry realities, this just being the latest one that we need to respond to.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Ted, do you want to talk further about the investment flows? Like you talk about the global shift, the geopolitical shifts. I guess, if you had the opportunity to leverage our advantages, what's the right way to incent the investment and the value adding? I mean, we've talked for so long about that, but it does feel like we suffer a lack of scale. We lack, competitive regulatory environment. We are high cost labor jurisdiction. I often think of the question strategically, but when you look at the position of a foreign investor that's comparing Canada today relative to other jurisdictions, and now particularly the US, on taxes and so on, are we dreaming to think we can actually leverage the new geopolitical environment to attract more foreign investment? And I'm thinking of China again. I mean, China is the second largest source of outflow of foreign direct investment in the world. And yet look at our relations with China. Are we really going to be able to or want to attract Chinese investment into value added processing of any sort into Canada?
I think the question is not so much do you want to attract the investment in, because where the investments come in, you generally speaking are more secure on your exports. So you've seen that happen in other countries. The question is more about control. I mean, that's where we have a problem in Canada. And I would say that in order of events, our biggest problem, I see many of the people on making comments on this have talked about the fact that, our food industries in Canada, and particularly manufacturing, are significantly owned by foreigners, particularly Americans.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you have a policy, whether it's agriculture side or the food side, a policy where you want the Canadians to do extremely well, as opposed to the owners, doing well in their own countries? That's particularly, for me, that's a big challenge. But in order to get to the right policy on that, you have to go back and say, how the hell did we get in this position in the first place? And one of the problems has been we had a system in Canada where if Canadian companies want to grow, particularly, and want to acquire another Canadian company, your chances are scarce to nil. But if a foreigner is asking to acquire a Canadian company, no problem. That's the history. And I've got anybody that wants to discuss that, I've got lots of evidence of that, and it's still going on today. As very recently, you've just seen another big acquisition go through that with very little challenge. So we've got a history where I think if a company's doing well in one province, another province doesn't really want that company to acquire something in their province. That's a problem. But putting that aside, going back to your other, where we're our own worst enemy. Putting that aside, if you go back to saying to your thesis, I think we should be trying to attract that investment. I don't think that investment have any trouble coming here, particularly around food. The number one policy in China is food. That's what it's called, the number one policy. And it's revised each year. And part of that, besides doing everything they can to grow more food in China and throwing massive amounts of money and R&D at it, which will have some success despite climate change, et cetera. But the other side of that is diversifying where they're getting the food from. And yeah, they'd be happy to take more and they'd be happy to invest more in Canada. But our job is to make sure that control stays in Canada. And so we got to do more on that side. And you can cite Japan. They have the people don't realize it, but Japan has a similar food policy similar to China's. They're getting bloody worried about it. And India is beginning to, everything in India is about politics of food when you boil it right down. And they've gone from the first time ever, they've gone from an exporter of food to an importer of food in the last year. And that's probably going to be the trend in the future. So Rory, I think we should be trying to attract investments from all those places, but we got to smarten up about how we can, what we allow for control so that investment come in, put it in the Canadian company or have a partnership with Canadian company, but you don't get to control
it. But there's two sides of that equation though, Ted, right? So it's one thing, how do you stop kind of our bigger companies from being taken over? But the flip side, and again, an area where and I don't think we're doing a good job of that, but we're also not doing a good job of taking those small and medium-sized companies and turning them into big companies, right? We seem to really like small companies that stay small, and we don't have a great system to say, okay, how do we take somebody that's a small and medium-sized processor, and Christina alluded to some of these challenges earlier, and turn them into a big company that hopefully would want to be taken over by a large multinational. Again, you got to then kind of put the right systems in place to make sure that doesn't happen in ways, but it can't just be, I often worry that this kind of defaults to the Canadian way of doing things. How do we just stop others from taking over our big companies? Whereas I think in the US, more of a cultural difference, they'd be more interested in saying, how do we grow more bigger companies? And there does need to be more of a sense of a desire to do that and to recognize that that's got to be part of the solution. Is how do we create more McCains and Maple Leafs from the kind of the small, medium-sized businesses we have today?
Absolutely.
And presumably that is also about overcoming our scale disadvantage nationally, eliminating interprovincial trade barriers, trying to maximize the domestic market, and I suppose competition policy, which does seem up to review. On the question of the politics of it all, Tyler, we're obviously in a, some call it the hinge moment. We're going to likely have a different shade of government before 2025 is out. What do you reflect on in terms of the meaning of potentially a conservative government in terms of embracing this challenge? Is it, are we going to continue to be as transactional as we have been in dealing with the Americans? Do you see an opportunity in the current thinking of the Conservative Party that would lead to a more strategic approach to all industrial sectors, but agriculture particularly?
I think that the starting point is always to acknowledge that I think that there is just this political difference in part based on kind of voter base and where MPs are elected from, that a Conservative government is likely going to take agriculture and food issues a little bit more seriously than a Liberal government is. It's a party of rural Canada and has more of that connection with farmers and food processors and others. So that's going to be different. We're likely to see a different kind of political direction come from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. But I actually think that there's also a really big difference between kind of what we hear in the headlines, and often people today get caught up around kind of Pierre Poilievre's kind of gimmicks that he uses around Axe the Tax and clearly the carbon tax in agriculture is going to go away. We know that the Conservatives are going to do that. But they actually have articulated some other policies around agriculture and food that give us a bit more sense as to where they're going to go. And they really do seem focused on how do we add more value in the Canadian context? How do we try and deliver more of that economic growth and that opportunity? And so I think we've got a kind of a clear sense that that's going to be a driving force for the Conservative government. How do they actually do that is a challenge. Under a previous Conservative leader, there was talk about greenhouses and other things like that. I mean, that's part of it, but what we're going to see is, I think, a competitiveness and actions to improve it and drive growth really rise to the top of the priority list in ways that they haven't today. That said, I think that there is still a lot of opportunity for the sector, different stakeholders in it, to really try and influence that agenda by coming forward with more concrete solutions around what it takes and the direction it goes. And again, I think there's going to be some opportunities grow to some challenges. I think we expect fiscal restraint will be an issue. Probably budgets will get tighter across Ottawa, but that should be an occasion where we say, if we're going to spend less, how can we make sure we're spending smarter than what we've been doing to date? And I don't think that we've got a great track record of investing money in the most effective ways possible. And that reset may be an opportunity for us to go back and say, okay, it's not just a question of what we're spending or how much we're spending, but how we are actually spending it and what we're spending it on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. We're approaching the end of our time, but maybe actually an anonymous attendee has made an interesting comment. The harder you work, the luckier you get. So maybe if I could just go around the table here then, in that sort of theme, Christina, what do we have to do? Can we get luckier through a little harder effort in 2025? What would be the hard work you would like to see happen? And in that theme of making our luck and taking advantage of what is a set of external circumstances that seem quite dire, how can we leverage those to do some of this hard work?
For us, for Food and Beverage Canada, it is capitalizing on this, recognizing it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt across the industry. It's going to hurt companies, employees, but really using it as another moment to reinforce for this government, for Canada, the sector's role. So for food and beverage manufacturing, the largest manufacturing industry, which means that if we don't start changing the way that we think about this industry and the way that we support this industry, we're going to have a decline of it that would ripple across the economy. It's going to impact GDP, it's going to impact employment, and it's going to impact food security. So I think right now we have an opportunity to make sure that we turn some of these challenges into more opportunities and that we have more of a forward-looking policy agenda instead of every few years, the next thing that happens that makes it so that we have to be reactive all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Tyler, what would be your advice at this point?
So there's a couple of questions in the chat around who speaks for the sector or what do we do with kind of this diversity of voices. I think if we're going to work harder, we need to figure out how do we work better together. And it's true, we're very different value chains. The needs of farmers are very different from food processors. But Canadians, governments often think about agriculture and food as one sector. And I think that we need to figure out ways to better think of ourselves as one sector together and do a better job coming up with those shared priorities and shared actions that we're looking for.
Good. And Ted, you started us off earlier with a very valuable lesson in history. So, if we're going to create kind of a McDonald type industrial policy in 2025 for Canada, what does it look like? And I think to Tyler's point, how do you get everybody rowing in the same direction in such a vast and complicated country with some very unique regional differences?
That question would take hours, but maybe I can sum it up in as simple terms as I can. I think, Rory, it's critical that we put our interests ahead of our values.
Mm-hmm.
I think if we start doing that in real time, that we'll find we create our own luck. And, so it would take hours to expand on that, but I think most people understand what I'm talking about. is that we have not been putting our interests first. We've been putting values up there, but you make no progress on values if you don't have some power behind it, and you will not get the power by extending the values. You get the power by extending your interests first. And or if you want to put it in a different way, interests trump, pun intended, values. And we've got to get with it.
Well, Ted, Tyler, Christina, thank you so much for your very useful reflections. Stay tuned to CAPI's work this year. We're going to be on top of a lot of these questions and generating some content and more webinars that hopefully will advance our thinking and our collective action. So thank you to everyone for attending, and I wish everyone a very good day.